AITA for calling out my husband's coworker at his corporate party for flirting with him right in front of me. Last weekend was one I'll never forget, but for all the wrong reasons. It started with a corporate party that my husband, Dan, 36M, had been looking forward to for weeks. Dan's company doesn't usually go all out for events, but this time, they were celebrating a major merger and the bosses wanted to make a splash. There were reservations at a fancy restaurant downtown, an open bar, a live band, the whole 9 yards. Dan had been talking about it for weeks, saying how excited he was for me to meet everyone and finally see the people he spent most of his days with. I'll admit I was excited too. I, 34F, don't often get a glimpse into his work life. Our conversations about it are usually short. He's tired after a long day, and I try not to press too much about office politics or the latest drama. But I thought that meeting his colleagues would be a great opportunity to feel more connected to that side of his life. Plus, I wanted to make a good impression. I spent way too long picking out a dress that was classy but not too flashy, and I even had my hair and nails done, wanting to look my best for the night. The evening started off well enough. We arrived at the restaurant, and the atmosphere was buzzing with that kind of energy you get when people are excited to let loose after work. There were about 50 or so people there, employees, spouses, even a few higher-ups. Dan introduced me to his team, and I made polite small talk trying to memorize everyone's names. It felt a little overwhelming, but I was determined to be the supportive wife who fit right in. We ended up at a table with some of Dan's closer coworkers, including his boss, a couple of IT guys, and a woman named Serena, 32F, who, as I understood, had worked with Dan for the past couple of years. Dan had mentioned Serena before, mostly in passing, how she was part of his project team and was great at getting things done. I didn't think much of it at the time. After all, coworkers are coworkers. At first, Serena seemed friendly enough. She greeted me with a big smile, saying how nice it was to finally meet Dan's better half. I laughed it off, telling her it was nice to meet her too. But as the evening progressed, I started noticing things that made my smile feel a bit more forced. Every time I looked over at Serena, she was glancing at Dan, and not in the casual way people look around a room. Her gaze lingered, her smile a little too wide. Once, when she caught Dan's eye, she even gave him a little wink. My stomach twisted uncomfortably, but I tried to brush it off. Maybe I was just reading too much into things. It wasn't a big deal, right? But the more the night wore on, the more uneasy I felt. Serena seemed to find reasons to bring up inside jokes between her and Dan, things that made everyone at the table chuckle but left me feeling like an outsider. There was one moment when she mentioned some crazy late-night work session and how Dan kept her going with his jokes and energy. She said it with a teasing tone, giving him a playful nudge. I glanced at Dan, expecting him to steer the conversation back to more neutral territory, but he just smiled and shrugged it off. The next thing I knew, some of Dan's coworkers started teasing them about how they must miss sitting next to each other every day and made little comments like, "You two just can't help yourselves." The laughter that followed felt like a slap in the face. Dan didn't do much to shut it down. He just smiled and muttered something about how they were just work buddies. It was meant to be dismissive, but I noticed he didn't actually tell them to knock it off. I felt a knot forming in my chest. I tried to remind myself that this was just office banter, and maybe this was just their dynamic. But when Serena kept looking over at him, smiling like they had some shared secret, it became harder and harder to ignore. I leaned over to Dan and asked quietly, "Is there something you need to tell me?" He gave me a puzzled look, saying, "It's just office banter. She's always like this. It's not a big deal." I wanted to believe him. God, I wanted to believe him. But the way she looked at him, like she was testing the waters, pushing the boundaries, it was starting to get under my skin. Things finally boiled over when Serena got up to grab another drink from the bar. As she walked away, she turned back to our table, caught Dan's eye again, and winked. One of his coworkers, some guy I'd never met before that night, nudged Dan with his elbow and said, "Looks like someone's eager for some one-on-one time." It was meant as a joke, but the implication was so clear it felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. I saw red. I was done with the forced smiles, the dismissive jokes, and most of all, with feeling like the only one who thought any of this was inappropriate. I leaned forward, my voice loud enough for the whole table to hear, and said, "If there's something you two want to share, I'm sure we'd all love to hear it." You could have heard a pin drop. Serena stopped in her tracks, her face turning a bright shade of red. She mumbled something about needing to use the restroom and practically bolted out of sight. The entire table went silent, with people looking anywhere but at me. Dan looked like he wanted the ground to swallow him whole. He turned to me, his expression a mix of anger and embarrassment, and hissed, "What the hell are you doing?" I tried to keep my composure, but I could feel my voice wavering with frustration. "I'm sorry, Dan, but how many times is she going to wink at you before it's not a joke anymore? How many inside jokes do you two have that I don't know about? And why isn't it bothering you like it's bothering me?" Dan put his head in his hands, clearly mortified. His boss awkwardly cleared his throat, saying something about needing to check in with other guests, and the rest of the table quickly dispersed, leaving the two of us sitting there in tense silence. I could feel the heat in my face, the adrenaline making my hands shake as I grabbed my glass of water. After what felt like an eternity, Dan finally spoke, his voice low and cold. "You just made me look like a fool in front of my entire team. Do you have any idea how unprofessional that was?" "Unprofessional?" I snapped back, struggling to keep my voice down as other partygoers milled around the room. "What about her flirting with you right in front of me? What about your friends making jokes like you two have some kind of special connection? I'm not going to just sit there and be humiliated, Dan." Dan let out a frustrated sigh, running a hand through his hair. "She's just friendly, okay? She's always been like that. It doesn't mean anything." I could feel my eyes stinging, and I blinked rapidly, trying to keep it together. "It means something to me, Dan. It means that she doesn't respect our relationship enough to act appropriately when I'm right there. And it means that you don't respect me enough to set boundaries with her." Dan didn't have a response for that. He just sat there, looking miserable and angry and maybe a little ashamed. We left the party not long after, barely speaking a word to each other on the drive home. I could feel the weight of his disappointment and embarrassment pressing down on me, but I refused to apologize. I had already swallowed so much of my pride that night. What was a little more silence? When we got home, Dan went straight to the spare bedroom without saying goodnight, slamming the door behind him. I lay awake in our bed, staring up at the ceiling, replaying the night over and over in my mind. Part of me wondered if I had overreacted, if I should have handled it differently. Maybe I should have waited until we got home to bring it up, or tried to talk to him more privately. But then I'd think about the way Serena had looked at him, like I wasn't even there, and I'd feel that surge of anger all over again. The next morning, Dan barely spoke to me before he left for work, and when he came home that evening, he still seemed distant. He told me that people had been talking about the incident at work, that his boss had pulled him aside to ask if everything was okay. He said it had been humiliating for him to have to explain that I'd misinterpreted the situation, and that he felt like I had damaged his reputation with his coworkers. I felt a pang of guilt then, hearing how it had affected him at work. But at the same time, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing the point, that he cared more about his professional image than about how I felt seeing another woman flirt with him in front of me. I tried to reach out to him, to explain how hurt and disrespected I'd felt, but he brushed me off, saying he needed time to cool down. It's been a few days now and he's still distant. He's not sleeping in the spare room anymore, but there's a tension between us that wasn't there before, a wall that I don't know how to break down. And now here I am, wondering if I went too far, if I should have just let it slide for the sake of keeping the peace. Maybe it was just office banter, and I overreacted because I felt insecure. But another part of me feels like I had every right to stand up for myself, to call out behavior that made me feel disrespected in my own marriage. So, Reddit, AITA for calling out my husband's coworker for flirting with him at the party? Did I go overboard, or was I right to draw a line? Story 2. AITA for being the reason my grandparents refused to help my dad anymore, and laughing when he and his wife complained about it. I, 16F, have been living with a lot of resentment and confusion for a while, and I need an outside perspective. Maybe I'm wrong, but I just can't bring myself to feel bad about what I did. When I was 7 years old, my mom passed away suddenly from a car accident. It was just me and my dad after that. Losing her broke me in ways I couldn't fully understand at the time. But what made it even harder was seeing my dad become so distant in the aftermath. He wasn't unkind exactly. He still made sure I was fed and got to school. But the warmth between us disappeared, like a light being switched off. I think he was struggling with his own grief, but it felt like I had lost both parents at once. My mom had left me an inheritance, something she had arranged well before her death, just in case. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough to help me with my future, college, or any other big steps I might want to take. My dad was put in charge of it until I turned 18. The terms of the inheritance were pretty strict. My grandparents, my mom's parents, made sure of that. They helped draft the will with her, so they knew it inside out. The money was meant only for me, to be used for my benefit, and only under specific circumstances if something urgent came up. When I was 10, my dad remarried. Louise, my stepmother, was charming in a very over-the-top way when they first got together. She always brought me little gifts or tried to include me in activities, but it never felt sincere, just a bit performative. She moved in with us along with her daughter, Emily, 8F now, who was only 2 years younger than me. I tried my best to be polite, to get along with both of them, but it always felt like they were guests rather than family. When I'd look at my dad's new, tentative smiles directed at them, I couldn't help but feel like he'd moved on from us, me and my mom, while I was stuck in the past. 2 years later, Louise and my dad had my half-sister Lily. I remember feeling a mix of excitement and dread about having a baby sister. At first, I even liked the idea, thinking maybe a new baby could bring our family closer. But that feeling faded as I realized how different everything was going to be. Dad became completely wrapped up in Lily's needs, and while that's understandable with a new baby, it was like he forgot I existed at times. I went from feeling like a third wheel to feeling completely invisible. It became clear pretty quickly that something was wrong with Lily's health. She was always fussy and sickly, and by the time she turned 2, she still wasn't hitting her developmental milestones. My dad and Louise went from doctor to doctor, desperately searching for answers. It was a really tough time for them. Eventually, when Lily was 4, the doctors identified her condition, a rare disorder that isn't life-threatening but could lead to a significant disability if not treated properly. Hearing that diagnosis felt like a punch to the gut, even for me. I watched as my dad and Louise struggled to come to terms with what it meant for Lily's future. They had to deal with constant therapy appointments, specialist consultations, and the financial strain that came with it. And even though I kept my distance from them, I couldn't help but feel a twinge of sympathy. They were facing something huge, and I knew it was terrifying for them. A few months ago, they found out about a new, highly specialized treatment that could help Lily. But there was a catch. The treatment was only available in a distant city, and it was expensive, way out of their budget. They mentioned that there might be government assistance, but getting access to those funds would take time, and they didn't want to wait. One evening, while I was in my room doing homework, my dad called me downstairs. Louise was there too, sitting on the couch, looking a little nervous. My dad explained the situation, how important the treatment was, how it could make a huge difference in Lily's life. He said they talked about it, and they wanted to use the inheritance my mom left me to cover the cost until other funding came through. I was stunned. My first reaction was an absolute, gut-level no, that money wasn't theirs to use. It was all I had left from my mom, and I knew she wouldn't have wanted it spent this way. My dad's face changed the moment I said no. He went from looking hopeful to hard and angry, like I just said something unforgivable. He said that I was being selfish, that it was just money, and that I needed to think about Lily's needs before mine. Louise, who had been quiet up until that point, chimed in, her voice all emotional. She asked me how I could be so cold-hearted, how I could look at my little sister and think only of my own future instead of helping her when she needed it most. She said it like she couldn't even fathom how I could refuse. And honestly, I snapped. I couldn't believe they were doing this, turning the one thing my mom left me into some kind of charity fund for Lily. I told them both that I would never forgive them if they took my inheritance. My dad's expression grew even colder, and he said that he'd already made up his mind. That's when I really lost it. I told him I'd read through the will with Grandma and Grandpa, that I knew he wasn't supposed to use the money like this, and that he'd be breaking every promise he made to Mom. He waved it off, saying, "Your mother's dead. I'm sure she would have understood if she were here. You'll get it when you're older." I told him I wouldn't understand, that he was betraying my mom's memory, and that I hated him for even thinking of taking that money. Louise looked like I'd slapped her, but I just didn't care anymore. I turned on my heel and went back to my room, slamming the door so hard the house seemed to shake. That night I couldn't sleep. I tossed and turned, thinking about my mom, about how she tried so hard to make sure I'd have something after she was gone. I ended up calling my grandparents the next morning, sobbing as I told them everything that had happened. They were furious, and not just with my dad, they were angry at themselves for not seeing the warning signs sooner. Grandpa said, "He's forgotten what it means to be a father first." My grandparents decided to confront my dad directly. They made it clear that they would no longer help him with anything. They'd been supporting him in small ways for years. Grandpa would fix his car without charging for parts, and Grandma would babysit Lily and Emily when my dad and Louise needed a break. But they cut off all of that the moment they found out what he was planning to do with my inheritance. For a few weeks, my dad acted like everything was normal, but I could see the tension building. Then, last week, he finally confronted me after a particularly nasty phone call with Grandpa. He demanded to know what I'd told them, how I'd turned them against him. I just laughed in his face. I reminded him that I'd warned him I'd never forgive him, that he'd chosen to do this, and now he was dealing with the consequences. He exploded, yelling at me for being heartless and selfish. Louise came in then, trying to calm him down, but she looked at me with so much bitterness that it almost surprised me. She accused me of not caring about my sister's suffering, of only thinking about myself. I told them both that I wouldn't forget how they tried to steal from me, and that I hoped it haunted them forever. The fight was loud enough that Emily and Lily heard everything. Emily was scared, hiding behind the staircase, while Lily started crying in her room. I felt guilty for a moment, but then I remembered how my dad and Louise had tried to guilt me into sacrificing the one thing I had left from my mom. It was all too much, and I just left the house, walking around the neighborhood for hours until I could think straight again. Since then, things have been tense in the house. My dad barely talks to me, and when he does, it's with that same cold anger that makes me feel like a stranger to him. Louise avoids me entirely, and the rare times we cross paths, she glares at me like I've ruined everything. My grandparents refuse to come over unless my dad's out of the house, and they've told him they don't want to hear from him unless it's about me or something urgent with the kids. My dad and Louise keep trying to guilt-trip me, saying I've turned my grandparents against them, that I'm the reason they've lost their help, and that if I could just have put my selfishness aside, things wouldn't be this way. They act like I've somehow destroyed their world because I wouldn't let them steal from me, and honestly, it makes me so angry that all I can do is laugh at how absurd it all is. But now, part of me wonders if I should have handled things differently. I feel guilty about the tension I've caused and for dragging my grandparents into it. Maybe I should have just let them take the money and tried to rebuild my future later. Or maybe I should have tried to find a way to compromise, even though they were the ones who crossed the line first. But deep down, I know that they would have taken the money no matter what I said. So, AITA for refusing to let my dad use my inheritance for my half-sister's treatment, for involving my grandparents, and for laughing when my dad and Louise blamed me for the consequences? Should I have handled this better, or was I right to stand my ground? Story 3. I, 26F, don't think my fiancé, 26M, is attracted to me. Advice needed. My fiancé came home from work one day and after talking for a bit, we came to the topic of kids. While we're talking, he turned to me and said our kids could have blue eyes. For reference, my fiancé has blue/green eyes, and so does the rest of his immediate family. I have dark brown eyes, and so does everyone in my immediate and extended family. Both my parents and both sets of my grandparents have dark brown eyes, and I don't know of any cousins/aunts/uncles that don't have brown eyes. I explained that I don't think that it's likely, given my family genetics, but it might be possible that our grandkids have blue eyes. He was genuinely upset at the thought of this, which took me by surprise, because I didn't think something like eye color would matter that much to him. I told him that his reaction hurt me, and he apologized. A couple of days later, we're grocery shopping together and he says he needs some aspirin. We pick some up and he casually mentions that aspirin suppresses melanin production. I didn't really think anything of it at the time. I thought he was just telling me a random fact. Later he mentions that taking an aspirin every day while you're pregnant can increase the chances of your baby having lighter eyes, and he suggests that I do this when I get pregnant in the future, since my eyes are so dark. This suggestion not only shocked me, but it also hurt my feelings again. I mean, would it really be that bad to have a baby that looks like me? Plus, there's already so much pressure about what you should not put in your body when you're pregnant. Adding a daily aspirin seems so unnecessary. We've been together for 8 years, and I've never dealt with something like this with him before. I told him that the suggestion was nuts, I don't think eye color matters, and that he was making me feel insecure. I'm not sure he's taking me seriously, and it's kind of turning me off from the idea of having a baby with him at this point. I'm not really sure what to do, but I know I feel awful about it. Am I overreacting / being too sensitive? How would you approach the situation? TLDR, my fiancé wants a baby with blue eyes so badly that he's suggesting I take aspirin to suppress melanin production because I have dark brown eyes. Edit. I just want to add that I really don't care what color eyes my kid would have, I just think the obsession with lighter eyes is odd. I know genetics are weird and it's very well possible I could have a kid with blue eyes, but I know that brown eyes are more common. Honestly, I have an appreciation for both brown and blue eyes, and I think they are both beautiful. I just care that I have a healthy pregnancy and a healthy baby more than anything. Edit 2. I'm mixed race for those wondering. Mom's Indonesian and dad's Irish. My fiancé's dad is Czech and I'm not sure about his mom, but she is blonde-haired and blue-eyed.